Hi, so this session is on how to teach culture, and it's the slides of the presentation that we did in Exeter for IATEFL in 2008. And the aim of it really is to look at three things. Number one is the methodology of using culture. I'm just going to put this onto slideshow so that we can actually get it a little bit clearer. There it is. We want to look at three things. Number one is cultural concepts that we need to teach. So what are the principles behind what we're doing? Secondly, I want to have a quick look at some new cultural materials which have become available, which I think offer a useful material for people using video, certainly in the classroom, who are interested in cultural teaching. And then thirdly, a methodology for how to use it. So we've got 18 slides altogether, so we'll move forward reasonably briskly, but be prepared for them to come up now. And here is the next slide, which is the key slide on cultural concepts, which is what do we expect? What is going on when we deal with somebody from another culture? And the cardinal rule is that as long as things are going fine, nobody worries too much about the culture. It's an interesting thing, a fluffy nice to have, as somebody mentioned to me yesterday, which is slightly insulting. But ultimately, it's when things go wrong that people fall back into their traditional cultural positions, and that's when you need to start looking seriously at the cultural operation. And what you need to understand, first of all, is that whenever we deal with each other, we have expectations. What are those expectations? We have values and attitudes that we have, which we grow up with, which come from our education, which influence what we expect from other people, and they have the same things from us. So basically, what are the expectations? Now, that's the first element of culture that you need to get into. Now, those expectations are also manifested in behaviors. And the behaviors are all about what we do in our lives, whether we shake hands, kiss or bow, or whether we talk directly or indirectly. These are all behaviors which reflect the particular expectations we've got coming from our cultures. However, what's even more important is understanding how to communicate, how to build the interpersonal skills which will actually make the relationship work. And one of these, as we'll see a little later, is that, very importantly, some people expect to build a relationship, and they're really interested in making friends. And that is a culturally indicated feature. Whereas other people say, no, for heaven's sake, let's just get the job done. And if the job goes well and we seem to get on doing it, then we may become friends. So you have cultures where building the relationship is absolutely of prime importance. And you have other cultures where, frankly, it's of importance, but not of primary importance. And that's what we need to think about. So the key thing in the classroom is to get people talking to each other, and above all, to try and get them talking about their cultural experiences. So here's an exercise which we use called Just Say Hello. We use it with teachers, but we also use it with students, particularly at the B1, B2 level. And we get people to work in pairs and just to say, what was your best ever cultural experience? What was the best experience you ever had in another culture? And what was your worst? Then we get the group to move into fours. Okay, and then from those four, they choose one cultural experience, one good one, one bad one, and then they group into sixes, and then they have to choose the most representative or the most important, most amusing, most interesting cultural experience that works for them. So what you've got is people exchanging cultural experiences. But you've also got this pyramid activity where groups come together to choose and discuss their cultural experiences and choose which ones they think is the best. And then finally, what the teacher does as facilitator is to elicit it from the groups, from each group, and then so every group gets to share, if you like, the best cultural experience and the worst cultural experience of their group. It's a great way of getting people together, a great way of getting people talking, a great way actually of being able to bring out those cultural anecdotes which are quite important. Okay, so let's move on. What we're interested to see is when we get the feedback, from the teacher gets the feedback on this, you ask the students to reflect on the story they chose. So we ask them, what was their behavior? How did they work dealing with the pair, the four, the six? What did they think? What was the other side's expectation in their story they told? What were the skills we used to match the two? Okay, what were the interpersonal skills we matched the two? And then, of course, what have we learned about teaching culture? And what we learn about teaching culture from an exercise like this is really two things. Number one, it's important to be able to have stories and experiences because that's how culture presents itself to us. Secondly, we need to have some way of analysing it and understanding it, what we've done, so that we can then carry that experience forward and it doesn't just remain a funny or horror story. Okay, so we'd move on to our next activity, which is also to do with communication. It's also to do with loneliness. One of the problems you have when you're joining a group anywhere, is that you often feel left out. You feel like the outsider. And sometimes you feel with a foreign group, especially when they might be speaking a foreign language, very much the outsider. So what you do is to try and give people the experience of doing this, and then you get them to reflect on the strategies they use to be able to form up conversation groups and break into conversations. At the least, it's how do you interrupt. At its best, it's how do you integrate a group and become part of that group in order to be able to link in better. So what we do is we divide our class into groups. The groups can be 5, could be up to 10, probably not more than 10 because you can't do it. And you get them all to choose, each group separately, their own conversation group. Okay, so they decide on a topic they want to discuss. It could be vacations, it could be, I don't know, anything, politics, whatever they fancy. But they really have to get into it. Then you take one group, all right? It could be even one person if it's a small group. And you take that person out of the room to do something, okay? And you say to that person, what I want you to do is to join the group, or the 10 people you've taken out. I want one of you to join each group, and I want you to tell them about your conversation. And you let it go for about 5 minutes so they get into their conversation. And then bring them back in, and they have to join the group. And the whole idea is that I have told all the other groups that whatever happens, this bloke who comes in and wants to join the group, keep him out. Ignore them. Don't talk to them. Don't smile at them. Don't recognize them in any way, unless their style absolutely compels you to do so. So the strategy is, the thing is, how does the person who's outside join in the conversation? Okay, so they do it, and it lasts about 15 minutes, and it's actually fairly interesting, and you see various people doing various things. So at the very end, you get the feedback. And the first piece of feedback is, what is the group's behavior? You know, did they acknowledge the outsider? Did they welcome the outsider? Remember, they had instructions not to do so. Or did they actually completely ignore the outsider? What was the outsider's expectation? Did he or she expect the group to welcome him or her? Was there an expectation that they'd be interested in what the outsider had to say? The answer is presumably not. So therefore, then, what interpersonal skills did you use to join in the conversation? And this can be really interesting. You get some people who barge into the middle of the group, sit there, and absolutely start haranguing the group in order to make sure they have to listen to them. The second one is the people who completely turn off and actually start throwing things at the group in order to get their attention. That can be really funny. The third one we noticed was actually people who would get somebody from the edge of the group and start talking to them, and then use them as a way to begin to talk to the other part of the group. But the best one was somebody who just stood there and smiled so happily and so jollily that eventually people wanted to talk to them because they were just so pleasant to be with. So it's interesting to look at what the interpersonal skills people can use. Do you take an aggressive approach? Do you take an approach where you take somebody off the edge of the group and talk to them and try and build a relationship that way? Or is it something you just show yourself to be part of the thing? Above all, what it seems is what you need is patience. And the skills that come out of this are patience, willingness to watch and learn about how the group is interacting, and willingness not to impose yourself, but to actually make yourself accepted. That's what seems to be the key. And people get a lot out of that. Okay, so we've looked at 2 activities then to try and build communication. However, then we need to understand what are the principles of the communication. And that's where we come into this work, which has been done at the University of Durham on developing interpersonal skills. And they were applied to the qualities of an international manager. But I think it actually applies across the board. And they are the 6 qualities. First is openness. Openness is the acceptance of otherness. In other words, non-judgmentalism. If you say something which is odd or unexpected or that you don't particularly like, don't judge it. It's just observe it, just see what happens. Okay? This is a very important quality because, as John Moll, who's a well-known cultural commentator, once said, you know, if you see something that surprises you, amuses you, or which you find absolutely horrifying, you may simply be in the presence of a cross-cultural communication feature. Just be aware of that. So things that horrify you, amuse you, or that may just surprise you may actually be because they are cross-cultural features. The second quality in developing interpersonal skills is ambiguity. Now this is interesting, because this quality is that quite often you're in a foreign culture, you're in a foreign country, and you don't know what's going on. And your natural tendency is to tighten up and try and control things, when actually you would be probably much better if you relaxed and went with the flow. And that ability to be able to relax and go with the flow when you don't actually know what's going on, but to have faith in the outcome, and above all in the people you're working with, is considered to be a very important quality. Third one's flexibility. Another factor is a wish to be able to impose a solution, or to be able to look and say, this is the way I think it should go. Now that's very common. And again, it's a way of us maintaining a degree of control. But actually, quite often, the people on the ground may have a better solution, which is more adapted to the local culture and the local environment than you have. So therefore, you need to be prepared to be flexible and accept the idea of different solutions, because the different solution may be the one that's actually going to work in that environment. One particular example is getting contracts signed, where the personal intervention by somebody who happens to know the people involved might be much better to get something signed than actually trying to do it all through email and other process. Quite often the personal contact will break through issues where all the communication techniques we've got will fail. Okay. Curiosity. This is actually an underrated skill. Most communication works when you show interest. And actually promoting somebody, and promoting them in the sense of getting them to talk about themselves, to tell you about themselves, they really actually then feel interested in you because you've shown interest in them. So that ability to be an active listener, to listen without judging, to be able to just listen and take on board what somebody says about themselves, is actually great. And that is the element of curiosity. Curiosity, interest in other cultures. What goes with that, of course, is empathy, the ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes, so the ability to see something from the other person's point of view. And if you can do that as well, then that too is very valuable. And last of all, the question of language adaptability. Can you adapt your language to the other person's environment? Now, okay, we may all be speaking English because it's the lingua franca and it's the way that most people communicate, especially in the business world. However, it's fair to say that even people who speak English very, very well often don't understand native speaker idioms. And secondly, people who don't speak English so well may be put off by 101 things, accent, grammar, whatever it happens to be. Therefore, the trick is to try and, without going slowly, to leave pauses in your speech to allow people to catch up, and avoid idioms and explain acronyms and things like that. These little tricks you can do really help you adapt your language to other people, which can really help. So then let's look now, having looked at the concepts and having looked at the communication issues, now let's look at the cultural methodology. Where do we get the culture from? Well, the basis is actually the textbook. The textbook actually provides most of what you need. You may want to bring other stuff in, you may want to bring specialist books in, but it's the textbook that's going to do the job for you. But not necessarily the textbook as we understand it, because we're not necessarily just looking at the text. What we're looking at is the pictures, which are always contain material which is going to be culturally useful to us. Look at the social site signs they put in. You know, the notices they might put in as illustration, the realia, the ads, for example, any jokes they put in, any slogans they put in. All these are giving you cultural information about the cultures which either the text is about or from where the publication comes from. Then look at the conversations. What are the phrases, what are the expressions they use which actually have a cultural significance as opposed to straight meaning? And of course, the moment you put something in English, it is going to have a cultural significance and you need to be aware of it. So you're looking at the conversations, you're looking at the articles, the reading passages, You're looking at any anecdotes that might be mentioned. And then if you want extra material, you can go on the internet to follow up subjects and ideas. You can look at radio and audio, listen to radio, BBC, for example, listen to iPod radio. It'd be excellent as a way of just picking up various bits of information. And then, of course, looking at videos and DVDs and going through that same process. Is there something there which seems strange, which surprises you, amuses you, or maybe horrifies you? And are you then in the presence of a cultural phenomenon? Is that something you need to investigate? So the methodology, the basis, the cultural material, the basic cultural material is what you do with your textbook, but then supported by other and mainly interactive media. Okay, how are we doing? I want to introduce a product which actually illustrates this, and it's called Europe at Work. It was a 4-year Leonardo-funded project for the EU, and it is now currently going through another, metamorphosis as Diverse Europe at Work, because we are extending the project and then also disseminating it in a number of countries. Basically, what it was a 10-country project which aimed at helping migrant workers integrate the host country workplace. We've got people travelling all over Europe, and the question is, they don't get accepted by the people in the country they go and work in. How do we actually help that acceptance process? Okay, so it's helping migrant workers integrate, helping host country workers become more accepting of different of migrant worker differences, because they understand what's going on and why. That's it. Now, having done it, we did a 10-country survey in 6 industries, and then what we did was produce on the basis of that a series of materials. And the materials were a 14-unit DVD with 14 scenarios, 14 2-minute or 3-minute dramas, which illustrate conflict at work. Then we produced a training manual to help people deal with that, and also a web-based self-study guide so that people could then understand that material and access it themselves and study it at home without actually having to go to face-to-face meetings either at work or at school. Okay, so that's the project. What we played in the actual program, and I don't know if we can get it into this presentation, but just it was a situation on dress. And the dress situation was somebody wanted to promote a finance clerk to a finance manager position, but said if they were going to do so, they would need to take off their hijab. That's the scarf which Muslims wear to hide their hair, and which just shows the face. Okay, and because they said, well, it wouldn't be good to meet customers, etc., like that. So what's interesting, of course, is the lady who was actually being interviewed for the post, rejected the post because she said, my religion is important to me, my hijab is part of my religion, and I'd rather not have the post and remain faithful to my religion. So what I'm interested in here is not so much the content of the DVD. I'm more interested in the steps that we took to understand what was going on. So the first one is a focus on perception. In other words, looking at that video scene, what seemed different to you, the viewer? And people pick up, just watching, because a picture conveys 1,000 words. And actually just watching a picture, you immediately pick up impressions that you can put into language. Second thing is to focus on behavior. And that's important. So you look at what did each side do, what did the recruiting officer, and what did the interviewee do? And what did each of them say? And what I would do then probably is to divide my class in two and have, let's say, the group on the left, which will look at what people say, and the group on the right will look at what people do, and then we get them together to compare notes. Then step 3, focus on expectation. What did each side expect? Remember what we said was expectations is that key to the cultural understanding. Okay, so the interviewee, the Muslim interviewee, expected some more respect for her religion. She didn't expect to find that her hijab might be a barrier to her promotion. The interviewer, I think, expected immediately, well, obviously her hijab is not going to be a problem because she's going to want to get ahead, and if I say remove your hijab to get ahead, I'm sorry about the pun, she will definitely do it. Okay, so there was a bit of a surprise element there. And then finally, focus on skills. We were left with the conflict, but you've got to ask, how could each side resolve the misunderstanding? And presumably by not having a standoff, but by having a better understanding and explanation of why each person took the position they did, because that will lead to some kind of resolution. But what is needed there is acceptance, non-judgmentalism, tolerance of ambiguity, I guess acceptance of flexibility, possible alternative solutions might come up. Certainly, ability to put yourself in the other person's shoes would be very, very important there. So all these factors that we discussed earlier are going to come in. Okay, we're doing well. We're moving on. What we need to understand that in the methodology that we're going to use, there will be two elements. One of them will be what we call critical incidents. In other words, you take situations, anecdotes if you like, little scenarios, little situations where conflict has occurred or tension has occurred. And then what you do is you basically ask people, what they think about it. So the experience for them is watching or seeing or learning about what happened. The second stage of this methodology is reflecting on it. Okay, now let's discuss what happened. What were their expectations? What did they say? What did they do? Okay, why did this conflict, why did this tension occur? All right. From that, you then get a conclusion. Well, clearly in this society, they like to do that. Most people seem to think this is important. This is a clear way of behaving which seems to be valid in that society. Application, the final stage, or implementation, the final stage, and very important, is what will I do and say, think? Remember that? Do, say, and think differently as a result of this experience. So that's what we call the learning cycle methodology. Number one, you have an experience. Number two, you reflect on the experience. You decide, you understand what happened, what people said, what people did. Number three, you draw conclusions. What does that say about the cultures of the people in the scene or in the anecdote? And then finally, what will I say, do, and think differently as a result of having had this experience? If you follow that methodology, which is a fairly straight methodology, it happens in everywhere where there is an interactive methodology in place, you will always have success with culture, because culture is about perception. And number two, it is about discussing various solutions. So it is by definition a very interactive subject. What we're actually looking at when we look at this process culturally, starting from this perception, is that we're trying to develop a number of skills, a number of ways of working, and we're trying to instill these into the students by using this methodology, this learning cycle and the critical incidents, to be able to arrive at a feeling where they become more culturally aware. And the stages they go through is, number one, perception, understanding what happens, understanding the nature of difference and what's involved. Secondly, they look at the behavior and they see what the behaviors are that are different, and they identify them. Then they examine those behaviors in order to build up an understanding of the expectation that lies behind them. If I do this, it's because I expect this. Okay? If I decide I need to have small talk with you for 3 hours before ever getting down to business, it's because I have an expectation that it's important to get to know you before I discuss business affairs. That would be a very good example of the expectation. Fourthly, then you try and build the skills which allow you to inquire about the culture, understand the cultural position of the other person, and showing, and working with that, so that finally you get to the stage where if there are any conflicts, they're easily resolved, because ultimately you understand where the other person is coming from and how they like to be dealt with. That's how it works. So if you understand the learning cycle on the one hand and the culture cycle on the other hand, you put the two together and you're actually able to build a very, very successful operation. Okay. Now, just to give examples, one of the most important things that people can do is to build their own critical incident scenarios. And we began with a little exercise on that at the very beginning of the presentation, when we asked people to choose their best and their worst cultural experiences. And that was quite interesting because, that brought out a good examples of things which could then become scenarios. So what we do, once again, you see, is to set up a series of 3-minute conversations. And we stress the importance of anecdotes as providing these critical incidents. You ask people to think of their best intercultural experience. You ask them what happened. You ask why was it so good. And they asked you, what skills did you and the others do to make it work? Now, it's interesting, this. I had an interesting experience just very recently. I was in Russia very recently, and I was talking to somebody. I was saying, I wrote to an awful lot of people in Russia who I wanted to be in touch with since I was in Russia, and people didn't respond. And my Russian colleague said, that's very simple. I said, why? They said, because most people have the experience of a Russia that says "niet," no. I mean, that's the great thing. It's a great myth about Russia, "niet," no. And actually, she said, we are as a nation don't really like saying no to people. So if we're not interested in something, or we don't have time for it, or we don't want to get involved right now, we just simply ignore it. She said, actually, what you should do is take the fact that nobody's replied, not as rudeness or anything like that, but just simply a way of saying, we don't really have time to do this now, so, please excuse us if we don't. So the email that I might send saying, hey, I would love to see you, but I'm busy, but I can't do it, is not something the Russians would do. It was probably something that they would prefer just to simply ignore and allow you to read between the lines and draw your own conclusions. But it's not considered particularly negative. It's just something people do. Whereas I was building up quite a big negative feeling about this, how rude, how unpleasant, how etc., etc. And I think it's important, therefore, to realize that when you use these what-if scenarios, they are examples which can lead you into understanding of the culture. Could be that maybe that understanding is not 100% valid, but nevertheless it gives you a platform on which you can build your experience. I don't think culture is scientific. What I think it is a perception, psychological disposition, which allows you to understand better how other people operate. So having done that final exercise with the class, having them all feel good because they've all exchanged great cultural experiences and discovered what skills you use, and the cultural skills is very important, then I think we are ready to move almost to an end. Number one, the what-if methodology, the importance of anecdotes, the importance of finding stories that illustrate intercultural differences. Get students to search for their own stories. Some of them can be quite funny. Analyze the behavior. What's happening? Is it linguistic behavior? Is it psychological behavior? What's the expectation? What was each party's expectation of the other? And then identify the skills which people use to resolve the misunderstanding. Did they refrain from judging? Were they careful to show flexibility? If they didn't know what was going on, did they want to dive in and ask forensic questions, or were they reasonably calm and relaxed waiting for it to come? All these skills, if they use those, they get results. So what does it draw us to understand about the teaching of culture in language? Well, number one, intercultural understanding offers additional dimension to language learning. It's not just part of language learning, it's an additional dimension, and it needs to be considered and treated as something a little bit separate, but very closely linked to language learning. Our view would be that language, if you learn the language, you should learn the culture. But there's something you don't learn. You don't learn the cultural skills, and they need to be taught, and they should be taught as part of the language classroom. Our view is also that intercultural understanding offers a psychological dimension. It does not necessarily have the precision of linguistics, but it has a psychological dimension. It is intensely subjective rather than objective. And again, that puts an emphasis on the perception element. It depends on perception of difference, observation of behavior, recognition of different expectations, and then the deployment of interpersonal skills to resolve possible differences. And it uses language teaching materials, skills and environments to develop the students' abilities to navigate, to be able to get around in a globalizing world. So we feel that although culture and cultural skills is a subset, if you like, of the whole language, we feel that language teachers are actually in the best position to exploit this and make it work. So there we go. I think we've done it. If you want to get some follow-up on this and you want to look at the Europe at Work project, go to www.eiworkplace.net, and what you will find there will be the specimen materials which you can download and work with, and they're free. And also, if you go to www.eiworkplace.net, www.dew-net.eu, www.dew-net.eu. You can see the follow-up work as it emerges. Okay, if you want lesson plans, some of the lesson plans I've been doing here, you have a look at Tomalin and Stemplesky's Cultural Awareness in the Teachers Resource series in OUP, and also there's some more stuff focusing on video and DVD in the book on film. If you want to learn more about other cultures, particularly the top 10 cultures suggested by, come back on that one in a minute, suggested by leading bank, Goldman Sachs, that's the one, suggested by Goldman Sachs for the year 2050, may have changed, of course, given current events. Have a look at the world's business cultures and how to unlock them. That could be quite useful to you as well. And if you decide you want to practice and learn these skills for yourself, here's the commercial pitch. We do run at International House a Business Cultural Trainer Certificate, the BCTC, 3-day intensive program which allows you to actually learn how to do this for yourselves. And for that you need to go to, not the one that I've suggested there, you need to go to www.ihlondon.com, and then what you need to do is go to the Executive Centre, and that will give you all the details you need.